Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Ready for another deep dive. Today, we're looking at a chapter from, well, it's called Tests and Measurement for people who think they hate tests and measurement. Catchy title, right?
Definitely grabs your attention.
It does. And it's all about performance-based assessment.
Which is basically how to really gauge learning.
Yeah, but going beyond memorization.
Exactly, getting into actual skills and abilities.
Because you don't just want to know what someone can remember.
Right. You want to know what they can do.
So, you ready to kind of uncover the strengths and challenges of this whole approach?
Absolutely. Let's dive in.
All right. So first things first, traditional testing.
Like multiple choice questions.
Yeah, those seem to be good at measuring knowledge.
They do. But they kind of fall short when you're talking about evaluating real-world skills,
It's like knowing the ingredients of a cake.
versus actually baking one.
Exactly. And that's where this performance-based assessment comes in. It's all about having students show what they've learned.
Yeah, through actual tasks, like giving a speech or designing an experiment or even creating a piece of art.
Instead of picking an answer, they're making something or performing something.
Right. And those are what we call constructed response items.
Which I guess are basically tasks where students have to create something complex.
Or give detailed written answers, think maps, reports, even sculptures, you name it.
The book actually gives this cool example, asking students to make a chart from some data.
And the interesting thing there is there's actually more than one way to make a correct chart.
Showing how open-ended these assessments can be.
For sure. It lets students be creative, use critical thinking, gives teachers a much better idea of how students are processing information and applying what they know.
That makes sense.
Right.
But scoring those responses, that must be kind of tricky.
It can be. It's not just right or wrong anymore.
Exactly.
That's where rubrics become really useful. They give you a framework for evaluating these complex tasks.
So a rubric is basically a scoring guide.
Yeah, you could say that. It lays out specific criteria and describes different levels of quality for each criterion.
I liked how the book used that self-portrait rubric for an art class. It wasn't just about the technique and skill.
It looked at effort, even behavior.
It gives you a much more complete picture.
Absolutely. One of the best things about rubrics is they look at the whole process, not just the final product. Effort, attitude. It's all in there.
And it makes grading clearer for everyone.
Definitely. Students know what's expected. Teachers have a consistent way to evaluate the work and give good feedback.
It's all about clarity and making sure everyone's on the same page.
For sure. And that clarity helps students a lot too. They can actually look at their own work, figure out what they need to improve on, and really focus on those skills instead of just going after grades.
So we've got rubrics for these individual tasks, but how do you assess someone's progress over a longer period?
That's where portfolios come in.
Okay, so the book describes portfolios as collections of work showing what the student's done and how much they've improved over time.
That's the basic idea, but it's not just throwing a bunch of assignments together.
Right, it's more than that.
A good portfolio has to be carefully put together. It should reflect specific learning goals, show the student's journey, how they've grown in a particular area.
Like those examples in the book. A science student might have lab reports, experiments, even their thoughts on what they found.
And for creative writing, maybe poems, essays, feedback they got from others.
It's capturing the whole experience, not just a single moment.
Exactly. It's about showing the evolution of skills and understanding.
But with all this, subjective stuff,
Yeah.
how can you be sure these assessments are measuring what they're supposed to and that the results are actually reliable?
Good point.
Yeah.
That brings us to validity and reliability, which are super important for any kind of assessment.
Right, making sure you're measuring what you think you're measuring and that the results are consistent.
And the book argues that these constructed response items in portfolios, they usually have high validity because they're focused on real performance. Makes sense. But keeping things reliable can be tricky.
Because there's that subjective element involved.
Even with rubrics, yeah.
Different teachers might look at the same rubric in different ways.
Leading to different scores, yeah.
That's why the book really stresses how important it is to have those rubrics clearly defined.
Absolutely. And training for the people scoring, especially if it's a large-scale assessment.
Yeah.
And good communication between teachers to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Oh, before I forget.
Yeah.
The book mentions they're using technology to score essays these days.
Oh, yeah.
Is that actually a thing?
Yeah, and it's getting pretty advanced. They've got algorithms now that can analyze sentence structure, vocabulary, all that.
Wow.
And they can even spot plagiarism. And a lot of times they give scores that are pretty close to what a human would give.
That's incredible. It makes you wonder about the future of all this assessment stuff and the role of technology in it. But we can save that for another time.
Sounds good.
For now, let's talk about another big piece of performance-based assessment. Essays.
A classic. Essays. They can be a bit daunting.
Yeah, but I always found them more interesting than just multiple choice tests.
Right.
Having the space to really lay out your thoughts, build an argument, it felt more challenging in a good way.
It definitely gets you using those higher-level thinking skills.
Not just remembering facts.
Exactly. When you really want to see how well someone can put information together, make an argument, communicate clearly in writing, essays are a great way to do that.
The chapter goes into a lot of detail about writing good essay questions.
Oh, yeah. It's more than just picking a topic and saying, go.
Definitely. It made me realize how much the way you write the question affects the answers you get.
For sure. The book talks about the difference between open-ended and closed-ended questions, for example.
Oh, right. Open-ended questions are more like, analyze the impact of social media on politics. It gives the writer a lot of freedom.
Lots of room for interpretation.
But with a closed-ended question, you're giving more specific directions.
Like, compare and contrast the strategies of two historical figures, focusing on their use of propaganda.
And so everyone's addressing the same points.
Right.
There were all these guidelines the chapter gave for making good essay questions.
Oh, yeah.
One that stuck with me was about clarity.
Makes sense.
It sounds obvious, but making sure the question is, like, complete and doesn't leave room for confusion.
Otherwise, students might not know what you're actually asking them to do.
Right.
They give a good example of a vague question. Discuss the impact of the Industrial Revolution.
Way too broad.
You could write a whole book on that.
Seriously.
They suggest adding more detail, like, discuss how the Industrial Revolution affected the lives of working-class families in 19th century England, looking at things like urbanization, labor conditions, and social movements.
That narrows it down a lot.
Gives the writer a much clearer path.
And everyone's focused on the same thing.
Yeah.
Another guideline that stood out was giving students enough time.
That's so important.
It's easy to think, oh, it's just an essay.
But it takes time to do it well.
The book breaks it down, saying you need time not just for the writing part.
Right, but also for planning, brainstorming, revising.
If you rush students, you'll just get superficial answers.
Exactly. Giving them the space to really think, organize their ideas, and refine their arguments. That's how they can show you what they really understand.
Okay, so we've talked about those constructed response items, rubrics, portfolios, and now essays.
Quite a range.
It feels like we've covered a lot of ground when it comes to assessment.
And each approach has its pros and cons.
The important thing is to pick the one that works best for what you're trying to do.
Sometimes a simple multiple-choice quiz is all you need. Other times, you really need to go with something more performance-based that lets students use their creativity and critical thinking.
And as we've seen with these performance-based assessments, there are so many options. It's not just about checking off boxes. It's about really getting a deep understanding of what someone can do.
And with technology changing all the time, who knows what new assessment tools are coming down the road. But no matter what methods we use,
Right.
the goal is still the same, to really understand what people know and what they can do.
So true. Well, I think we've covered the main parts of performance-based assessment.
I think so too.
Now, I think it's time to wrap things up with some final thoughts for our listeners.
Welcome back. We've been talking all about this performance-based assessment, and, it's really gotten me thinking about how we can do a better job of evaluating learning.
It's about moving past those old ways of doing things. Focusing on just memorizing facts.
Yeah, like those fill-in-the-blank tests.
Yeah, exactly. And instead, really looking at those higher-order thinking skills, problem solving, being able to analyze things critically, creativity. Those are the skills that really matter, the things you actually use in the real world.
Right.
And what really struck me is this idea of shifting from just measuring to actually understanding what someone can do.
It's not just about giving grades or checking boxes. It's about giving feedback that actually helps people grow and get better at what they do.
Exactly. And we've talked about all sorts of techniques, constructed response questions, rubrics, portfolios, essays.
There are a lot of tools in that toolbox.
Right. And each one has its own, strengths and quirks, depending on what you're trying to assess.
Yeah, for sure.
I really like how performance-based assessment allows for a more holistic view. You're not just looking at the finished product.
Exactly. You see the whole process.
The effort, the progress.
Yeah.
It's all there.
It's kind of like, if you're judging a chef, you wouldn't just look at the final dish, right?
Right.
You'd want to see their technique, their creativity in the kitchen, how they handle those unexpected problems that pop up.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yep.
You get a much better picture of what they're capable of.
Exactly. And that's what makes this type of assessment so valuable, and not just in education either.
Oh, yeah.
Think about evaluating employees or tracking progress in therapy, even just personal growth.
It's about seeing the bigger picture. So for our listeners who are, kind of hooked on this idea,
Yeah.
where would you suggest they start?
Well, I'd say start by thinking about your own goals. What are the skills you're trying to develop or assess? And then think about the techniques we've talked about and see which ones might make the most sense for you.
Like the book we've been talking about today is a great place to start. It gives you a really good overview.
It does. And there are a ton of resources online. Articles, research, webinars, you name it.
Don't be afraid to try things out and adapt them to what you need.
Exactly. You might even find some new and creative ways to assess learning and growth.
This whole deep dive has definitely given me some ideas. I'm already thinking about how I can use some of these ideas in my own work.
That's great. That's what it's all about. Taking these ideas and actually putting them into practice. Making learning better, helping people grow, and really understanding ourselves and others better.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into performance-based assessment. We hope you learned something new.
And maybe it even got you thinking about how we evaluate learning and potential in a whole new way.
Because it's not just about measuring, it's about understanding, and that's an important journey.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep diving deep, everyone, and keep those minds engaged.